As someone who is the director for the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, I wrestle with that question a lot. Diplomacy to me is how a state enhances, furthers, and protects its interests abroad in using non-military tools. It's not strictly, it is a state's relations abroad, but it is not strictly state to state. Diplomacy has to work with the media, with civil society, with the academic world, with the business world. And so it is state relations, but not limited to the other side's government. Well, I think it's interesting to note that having a Department of State or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as some people call it, goes back to the very founding of the Republic. And in fact, even the Articles of Confederation, which were a disaster in terms of structuring our government, had a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this idea that the government, the state, needs to be involved in trade relations, security issues, protection of Americans abroad. It can be things like copyright now, climate change, Ebola. We are the vehicle through which U.S. interests, U.S. security is pursued abroad. We are the original conflict prevention people. It's not just negotiating your way out of a conflict. Hopefully what you've done is prevent the conflict in the first place. And so unfortunately, when diplomats are doing their job very well, it doesn't show. So it's conflict prevention, it's conflict mediation, and finally, if all else fails, is conflict resolution. The negotiations are also not just the formal negotiations that you'll see on TV with two sides sitting across on a very long table. It's a day-to-day kind of engagement with other countries. It may be something as simple as trying to ensure that our apples can be sold abroad. It may be something as basic as trying to protect who's coming into the country. You're doing it on a small basis, day-to-day level, so that it doesn't get up to a conflict. Well, I think the most obvious sacrifice that we all make is that we're not living at home. And it's kind of an irony that we care very deeply about our country. We want the very best for our country. And in order to do that, we don't live in our own country. And I can assure you that most diplomatic posts are not Paris and London and Rome. Most of them are very difficult countries, some of them very dangerous countries. So we're separated from our families. We're separated from our own society. We travel a great deal. We're living abroad. So we have a very different lifestyle and a very different family life than even our military colleagues may be deployed for a year or 15 months, but their families stay here and they come back here. We are living abroad with our families, but separated from our broader families in our society for years on end. I think the Foreign Service has done as well, possibly better than almost anybody else, at least in the federal government and in many other governments around the world too. It has not always been welcoming to women. I won't make that claim. But in recent decades, it has really taken a number of steps to make it clear that women are part of the service. We have ambassadorships. If you take a look at the State Department, at least today, most of the regional assistant secretaries are women. We have ambassadorships and deputy chiefs of mission. And so I think it's a perfect career for a woman who's interested in this. Oddly enough, in the Middle East, I don't really think it was a particular problem. We have some ideas about how Middle East society and culture works that I think are somewhat distorted. When I was first recruited for the Middle East Bureau, I had the same questions that anybody would have about, am I going to be able to work effectively? And the answer at that time was, we don't know, but we think it will work and we would like you to be one of the pioneers. So doing that first tour would have been an experiment. My decision to then spend the entire rest of my career working in or on the Middle East, I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't effective and if I didn't basically enjoy where I was living, because you do have to like where you live. So I don't think being in the Middle East, it's a problem. There are some times that dealing with our own military can be a little bit more challenging than working in the Middle East. We have an extraordinarily male-dominated military structure. Certainly counterterrorism is. And so I think, yes, having to prove my mettle took a little bit longer than in some other cases. It might have for my male colleague. But I ended up doing that for a very large part of my career too. So I think it's entirely doable. Right. Hijacked, held hostage, blown up, shot at. Diplomacy's always been a high risk career, and if somebody wants to go to the C Street entrance of the State Department, they can see that it's always been a very high risk, very dangerous job. And oddly enough, in contrast to the military, the more senior you become, the greater the risks that you face. It has gotten, I think, markedly worse in the last several years. At the same time, I think American society has also become far more risk averse, and therefore the kinds of situations that we expect people to live in or to have their families with, I think that's also changed. There are people out there who definitely wish us ill. One of the major debates within diplomacy and with those that we work with, though, is there such a thing as risk aversion, risk avoidance? And I think most people in diplomacy would say that there is risk management, but you cannot do the kind of engagement outside the walls of the embassy with a broad range of people, understanding what is happening in that country, what are the dynamics. You can't do that behind 10-foot walls or through bulletproof glass. There's an element of risk that I think everyone in the diplomatic corps understands and accepts as part of the job. I really have a very hard time answering a favorite moment. And I mean this quite honestly, I really didn't know what I was joining when I joined the State Department. I was joining more of an idea than anything I knew anything about. And I was going to stay for 10 years, and in those days there weren't a lot of women in the State Department, so my expectations were a little low. I ended up staying for over 30 years, and while there are clearly moments in my career where I wish I was someplace else, I never really had a day when I wanted to be doing something else. There were crazy moments, there were very heartwarming moments, there were ones where I really felt that I had made a difference to something called broad national security, and sometimes where I just made a big difference to somebody's life. So yes, I would have a very hard time saying a favorite moment. I loved all of it. I was very fortunate when I was in high school that I had a summer class on foreign policy. And there were all these very nice people who came out to talk to us about their foreign policies. I realize now they were the most junior vice consul in the consulates of where I grew up. But when you're 16, these guys looked really impressive. And I liked international politics, and I wanted to do something, but I had no idea what doing meant. And I suddenly started hearing from these people who were doing international policy. And I did a research paper on the U.S. Foreign Service and said, that is all I want to do. And so while I do not think that 15 and 16-year-olds should decide their entire life course at that age, I did. I think the challenges are, part of it is it's a far more complicated world, as we were talking about earlier. And even if you take the danger out of the more complicated, we're dealing with issues that are transnational. They can be climate change, they can be pandemics. You have the problem of refugees coming across our border. If there were ever issues that could be solved entirely by the state or entirely by two countries, I don't know what they are anymore. And so we're not even playing a three-dimensional chessboard anymore. We're playing kind of it's like a Rubik's Cube chessboard. And being able to manage these non-traditional issues of being able to, the State Department's not the only player anymore, if we ever were. And so a diplomat needs to know how to work interagency. They need to know how to work with the business community across the board. And so your ability to not just multitask, but to multi-issue, I think that is a major challenge. It's a challenge our country faces, and it's one that each diplomat faces individually. Well, we do, and in some countries, it's making sure that an American company is able to compete on a major contract. It can go as far, almost to the other extreme. One of the issues that I had to deal with in Yemen was trying to secure the ability of the Washington State apple growers to import apples into Yemen, which I'm sure you did not understand was one of our major foreign policy challenges. But it was a major issue to the Washington State apple growers. Dealing with business people who are coming in, who are trying to assess both the business opportunity and the risk factors. But I would say our basic job is to try to ensure that there is at least a level playing field. If somebody would like to go back and read the national security strategy all the way going back to Eisenhower, it's security, economics, and values are always the three core issues that we're trying to protect, defend, advance. But values are always there. Part of that is the nature of the United States. We believe very deeply in our values. We believe they're universal. We believe that most people would like to live in a participatory, non-corrupt, non-predatory state. And we believe we have a particular ability to encourage that, maybe a particular obligation. And so it's always been a constant in our foreign policy, different emphases in different places. I think we're better when we project and live our values than when we just talk about them, though. And perhaps one example of that would be the decision by the Department of State to send women diplomats to countries where women don't have full political and social status yet. And when I went to Yemen as ambassador, we had women diplomats, but we had not had an American ambassador. And in a sense, I was able to demonstrate that why we think this is a good value, why do we think that women can and should be in these positions. And one time I got a little uncomfortable because my public profile in Yemen was very high. I was on the evening news and on the front page of the newspaper. And I actually went to somebody in their press office and said, I don't think it's appropriate that the American ambassador is that high profile. It wasn't a security issue, I just didn't think it was appropriate. And the answer I got was a very interesting one, which is we don't have a lot of women role models in this country yet. And to the extent that people see you in a position of power, authority, responsibility, you're able to act as a role model that we need and want. And Yemen appointed its first woman ambassador while I was there. So sometimes what we're able to do is not a grand conference on women's empowerment. Sometimes it's something as simple as sending a woman diplomat, and people can see that, yes, it works. American diplomats are always working both on transnational issues and multilateral issues. And I guess the difference to me would be that multilateral issues are many states involved. Transnational issues are the kinds of issues that just simply don't respect borders. Again, climate change, diseases are two. Let me turn it around. If an American diplomat were to only deal with strictly bilateral issues between the two states, did not involve their other diplomatic colleagues, if it wasn't seen in a regional context, much less an international context, you simply wouldn't be doing your job. Well, I think part of what we can do on, again, let's say transnational issues, is we are the eyes and ears, I would also say in some ways the brains and hands of the U.S. government abroad. And part of what we will do on a transnational issue is explain what the local context is. All transnational issues do have a local aspect to them. And how do you approach this part of it? What are the particular challenges here? If the Saudis don't appreciate climate change because their economy is based on hydrocarbons, how do you explain that both to the United States government, but then also going back to the Saudis and explaining, if the sea levels rise, you lose Jeddah. And then that plays into multilateral. So the transnational issues play into the multilateral diplomacy. And the diplomat is kind of the fulcrum, I would say, between those two issues, between the issues and the forum. Sectarianism is a real issue. I mean, we see this every day in the news. But sectarianism, I want to get away from this presumption that you hear a lot, that the Sunni-Shia divide goes back centuries, it's deep, they've always hated each other, they've always been slaughtering each other, and this is just the continuation and most recent manifestation. That's not true. In many ways, Sunnis and Shias have managed to live together better than Protestants and Catholics did in Europe up until fairly recently. The divide is not even that great. What has happened now is that you have resource competition, you have power competition, you have identity issues that have been cast into Sunni-Shia. And that has become the shorthand and the vehicle to address other issues. If you look, for example, at Bahrain, where, yes, you have a Sunni-led monarchy, and yes, most of the opposition is Shia, it looks like it's very simple. It's Sunni-Shia. It's as much a question of access to jobs, of access to political power and participation, of normal sense of discrimination and identity that gets played out as Sunni-Shia. If this was essentially a theological debate, it would be solved by the muftis with edicts that come down. But that's not where the problem is coming from. So that is the vocabulary, it is the identity, it's very real. But I think we need to understand that it's being driven by economics, governance, and if you want, man-made problems that therefore are open to man-made solutions, not God-based debates that can only be decided by clerics. Yes, Saddam Hussein was very good at holding things together. I don't think that is the only way that you hold it together. Option B is a pluralistic, participatory, open process where people feel that they have a role in their governance and they have an economic future based on their own merit, not by what group you belong to. If you think that all the political power is going to the Shia, and therefore I, as a young Sunni, no matter what I do, I will always be dispossessed, then that becomes your identity and that becomes the basis on which you're fighting. Moving it to a Sunni strongman who will then guarantee my status as a young Sunni doesn't answer the problem. So the real issue is a pluralism, a toleration, a participation. Whether it's done in a democratic structure, I don't think is important. I do think the transparency, the participation, the equity. Strong men tend to gloss over the problems and hold them down as opposed to solve the problem. And I think the issue is, how do you solve it? Ironically, though, I was served in Iraq when Saddam was in power. And I can tell you it was one of the most ghastly places I ever lived. But one of the things that Saddam did that was brilliant is there was not just repression, because even that will only go so far. There were these massive photographs of Saddam everywhere, but Saddam as a marsh Arab, Saddam at a Shia shrine, Saddam in a Christian church, Saddam this, Saddam that, Saddam basically the Iraqi chameleon. And what he did is that he didn't suppress all the different identities. He actually absorbed them and adopted them. And that's not the kind of pluralism I'm actually, suggesting. But it wasn't a one-dimensional, one element of society suppressing another. To be honest, if you were a Sunni in Iraq and you transgressed, you were just as dead as if you were a Shia. If you played inside the rules, you were basically fine. So strongman, even that doesn't quite do it. And another one I think that is instructive is just looking at Tito's Yugoslavia. Yes, he held it together as a strongman, but he also worked inadequately, insufficiently on trying to create a new identity. So strongmen are not the answer. They just delay the problem. I don't think the borders will ultimately be redrawn. Certainly this is what ISIS is looking to do, this Islamic Caliphate. Oddly enough, even the last caliphate that you had, which were the Ottomans, had the equivalent of national borders. There was an Iraqi wilayat. There was one in Syria. So even then, it wasn't all one. So these extreme Islamists are going back to a golden age that never existed. I think national identity will ultimately come forward. I don't know, however, what's going to happen in Iraq. I don't think that most Iraqis want to divide the country into three. I don't think they want to drive out the other 27 ethnic and religious groups. But I think there has been such a failure of government in Baghdad, where you didn't have this Saddam's sham chameleon approach to Iraqi identity. You had a very Shia only. And the Sunnis didn't feel there was anything. The Kurds don't feel connected. And if Iraq does divide, it's not going to be this sectarianism, it's going to be a failure of political governance. Now, it could end up being divided that way, but it's going to be ugly because not all Sunnis live in the middle, not all Shias live in the south, not all Kurds live in the north. And even within those three great groups, some people are educated urbanites, some are uneducated farmers. It doesn't divide that simply. No country divides that simply. There is a battle going on for the soul of Islam. What is the nature of an Islamic State in the 21st century? And we're seeing the ugliest manifestations of it. I don't know how it's going to finally sort itself out, but redrawing boundaries, you then really start getting into senses of sovereignty and nationality. The boundaries may have been artificial at the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to have to own that one too. But at this point, you have young people who were born in Lebanon. They are Lebanese. They're not Syrian. They're not Israeli. They're not Turkish. You have young Omanis. They're not Emiratis. They're not Yemeni. And so the sense of national identity is much stronger now than I think people understand and give credit to. If somebody else wants to become part of Oman or become part of Lebanon, that would be fine. But I'm not going to break up my country. I'm not giving up my nationality. And so redrawing lines starts to get very difficult. And I think at that point, there is this understanding that you can tweak around the edges, but we're basically stuck with the nation states that we've got. Even the EU, which is the greatest experiment in kind of a regional integration, still respects state lines. It didn't go that far. I have a 12-week course on that. Let's see if I can get down to a short answer. The idea that we have to choose between security and democratic values, I think is a false choice. If you just try to do security, and we did in some places, well, let me back that up. It's a false choice. The real goal should be to try to establish stable governments. And if they are stable, they are probably closer to our democratic values. But that it is a stable government that is a truly secure one. Where we have made mistakes, and others have made mistakes, is equating military security with political stability. And we did this ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan, that if we could militarily secure an area, that was a victory. But there was never the economic development and the political governance to go with it. And so we never moved from security to stability. And I guess I would say that we don't need to choose between the two, that if we want true security, we need to get stability, and stability is a political and an economic issue. Well, I think one example of how diplomacy directly affects Americans and what our sense of commitment to the American people is was, as some people may remember, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and I was the deputy chief of mission. We had 3,000 Americans trapped in the city, and Saddam had threatened, and you always would take a threat from Saddam very seriously, had threatened to turn them all into human shields and actually had begun to round them up. The U.S. government was able to secure the evacuation of all of our dependents and non-essential personnel in the embassy. But we couldn't do anything about the 50 American private citizens who we had given sanctuary to in the embassy and the 3,000 Americans out in the city. And so even though we could leave, many people wanted us to leave, my father would have liked me to leave, 8 of us opted to stay. And we stayed in part to keep the flag flying and make it clear that we didn't accept the annexation of Kuwait, and that's kind of a macro political. But the real reason we stayed is we had 3,000 Americans, and we felt that it would be unprofessional, unethical, immoral to leave and leave them behind. And so the 8 of us stayed, and we became hostages. We were locked up in our own compound. We had no food, water, electricity, plumbing, or much of anything else. But it's a very long story, but the short version is we did manage to get every American citizen out of Kuwait. We did not lose a single American. We got all their pets out, which is important if you're a 7-year-old and you're already traumatized. We also got the nationals of 35 other countries out. And if you remember, Desert Storm had about 35 other countries helping us militarily. So we repaid the favor in advance by getting their nationals out. And it was only when we had the last American out and we knew that that part of our job was taken care of, did the 8 of us then go back and say, now we're ready to leave. And so we left about 3 weeks before the beginning of Desert Storm.